world is in the grip of this pandemic, but I am pleased to be simulcasting again with Shaun Attwood. Shaun, how are you?
Yeah, the whole world are now prisoners everywhere. Everyone's in prison now, and I used to be the only person who'd been in prison. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in the prison population that can be transferred over to the public right now about dealing with lockdown. I see a lot of people all over the world are in the shock phase, but there are various stages of adaptation.
Hmm. And you have obviously hundreds of thousands of people who turn into your broadcasts every day. You've been doing amazing work on Epstein tracking Ghislaine Maxwell there in London. You're an activist, you're an author. There's a lot of new subscribers on Crowdsource the Truth since you were on last time. People can learn more about you by going to ShaunAttwood.com. That's your website. You've written a bunch of books about topics that are going to be very interesting to Crowdsource the Truth viewers. There was a really great documentary made about you. It's always cool. I wondered how you felt having some actor play you and then watch that on TV to relive it. But it tells the story of how you were an unlikely drug kingpin, which is always difficult for me to believe because you're such a nice guy. It's hard to imagine that. But you've reformed yourself, you've paid your debt to society, and you're an amazing example of someone who has now dedicated his life to educating youth and helping people stay out of jail and stay off of drugs. Shaun, what's been happening in London since this pandemic thing started?
So what happened was the people in London were just going about their business, and Boris Johnson was saying about 2 weeks ago that it was no big deal. They were going to let it spread. We needed to get herd immunity, and they weren't really taking the serious measures needed to minimize the deaths. Then all of a sudden, Italy started to exceed China. Spain caught right up. And presently, deaths in Italy and Spain are in the 600 to 800 level per day. Just heard news today in Madrid, the ice rink is where they're putting the corpses. Prior to that, in Italy, they were putting the corpses in churches, and people were getting turned away because once those intensive care units fill up and they only have limited equipment, the ventilators, the oxygen, critical cases are getting turned away. People are getting just laid down in corridors with blankets thrown over them. So the gravity of the situation started to sink in. I think when something comes out of China, there's an element of it's not going to happen in our backyard. But once it started to cross into Europe and the deaths were exceeding China, the government was forced to take action because Italy's got one of the best healthcare systems in the world. And if that healthcare system can collapse within a matter of weeks, it indicates what's about to come here. So the estimates are now that the tsunami is going to hit the UK and the US in a 2 weeks' time. We are both rising. If you look at the curves, the US and the UK are rising right now faster than the curves for Spain and Italy. So our governments now know the lockdowns are essential to minimize the deaths and to get everybody prepared. And I've been interviewing people on the front line in Spain, on the front line in Italy, and putting those webcam interviews on my channel so people can see the words right from the source.
Mm-hmm. And people can go to the Shaun Attwood YouTube channel and subscribe if they aren't already doing that. You've been interviewing a lot of people with firsthand information. You've just done an interview with Dr. Paul Cottrell pretty recently. He's a Harvard. This was interesting. It was the first time I became aware of this. Dr. Cottrell is not a medical doctor. I applaud you for bringing that out. Can you sum up what Dr. Cottrell told you in that interview?
So in prison, I read books about diseases and pandemics, and I understand how these cross over from the animal kingdom. And actually, we consider ourselves humans. How can these come from bats and birds and horses, etc.? But the fact that they jump from animals to humans shows we are part of the animal kingdom as well. We're just special animals that think of ourselves so highly. Now, Cottrell, he is of the opinion that the level 4 bioweapons lab in Wuhan, which was experimenting on coronavirus and vaccines, he's of the opinion that it leaked from there, and he has analyzed certain factors that he laid out with all the scientific vernacular, the HIV delivery system, and all this other stuff. And it's been quite popular on my channel. Now, today, I'm interviewing another expert who wrote a book called Spillover about the origin of it from the animal kingdom. So I would like to get both sides of that story firmly published on my channel before anybody jumps to conclusions, because Mother Nature has killed more people than the biggest crime families in the world. The Bush crime family, the Clinton crime family have killed nowhere near as many people as the Spanish flu. That killed more people than all of the world wars in the last century combined.
Right. And people can purchase your books. You've written about a lot of these crime families. You've got an amazing insight into the criminal aspects, the financial aspects, the political aspects. You're just, so articulate on these subjects. People who haven't read these books are going to want to go back and check them out. And as I said, these are all topics that are going to be very interesting to viewers of Crowdsource the Truth. So while everybody is under lockdown and at home looking for things to do, it's a good time to purchase the books. I guess Kindle books are very popular right now because people don't want physical items shipped into their homes. It's a pretty bizarre change to everybody's day-to-day life. How's the shopping in London right now?
Well, what I'd like to say on the subject of the books is, because of the hardship that people are going throughout the world under presently, I am making all of my books free throughout the period of the lockdown. I'm
Wow.
going to do one book after the other. So each week, one of the books will be free on Kindle. So you can go on Amazon right now, anywhere in the world, pull up Shaun Attwood, Prison Time, and that is the book that is free this week. And you can just click on it. It says price zero, and you can purchase it at the zero price and read it on any device using the Kindle app. Next week, I'm making The Mafia Philosopher, Two Tonys free from Monday to Friday. And perhaps the next week, I'll make my book that came out at Christmas, which your guys will love, is Clinton, Bush, and CIA Conspiracies, The Boys on the Tracks of Jeffrey Epstein. I am presently working on a book, Who Killed Epstein, and I think I'm going to have a picture of Prince Andrew and Bill Clinton on the cover.
I remain skeptical if Epstein is even dead, but that's a separate topic. We'll stay focused on the pandemic. So, see, it's an interesting subject with Dr. Cottrell. Is this, COVID-19 a bioweapon? Now, frankly, my view on that topic, Shaun, is, if you think about something like a screwdriver, I was discussing this with Bishop Larry Gators the other day. Obviously, you go into the hardware store, you buy a screwdriver, it's a tool. But if somebody stabs somebody in the neck with it, it's a weapon. So I consider the fact that any pharmaceutical company, any biology lab that's doing legitimate work pursuing vaccines for dangerous and deadly viruses is going to have samples of those live viruses there. If a sinister person was to gain access to that and go smash it in the wet market in Wuhan, certainly that's a bioweapon, even though it's just a virus.
Well, what would motivate them to do that? Let's look at 9/11. My wake-up call, I can't remember if we discussed this the last interview, was that I was an options trader in the stock market. And in the week preceding 9/11, huge bets came in the options market, betting that the airline stocks were going to crash. And these bets were so extraordinary, they made news headlines after 9/11. The news headlines said that it had to be terrorist insider trading. These trades will be tracked and the culprits will be brought to justice. Now, that headline completely disappeared out of the news. It's still on YouTube. If you put in 9/11 insider trading headline, Google it. It disappeared out of the news because those trades were tracked back to a brokerage that was run by CIA. And anyone who had any knowledge of those trades, the feds came in, they deputized the people which means if they spoke about their knowledge of those trades to anyone else, they would be arrested and thrown in prison. So can you imagine then if you could crash the stock market with a virus? We've seen a 40% fall. How much money you could make? You could make billions if you knew that was coming
Right.
by placing those bets. But having studied the history of how these things come from the animal world, I think I'm about 80% zoonotic right now and 20% bioweapon.
Hmm. Well, I mean, again, I think that if it were a virus that were dropped into the wet market, you're posing the question of, who would benefit from that? Always a good question. Has there been any information about stock trading, put options, short selling of things that people knew would go down?
The information that's come out is that senators and
Right.
legislators who were at health meetings and privy to the serious nature of what was about to arrive, while telling the public it was no big deal, were selling their holdings left and right. And insider trading laws, look at the whole legal structure in general. One of the purposes of the law is to protect the interests of the most powerful people, the politicians, the legislators, the most wealthy business owners. So every now and then they make an example out of someone, Martha Stewart, Ivan Boesky, but there's no way in hell these guys are going to get held accountable for their actions.
Exactly.
It's one law for them and it's one law for the other, just like Prince Andrew is just laughing his head off right now at the world. He's loving that travel ban, and he knows he's never going to be brought to justice. Whereas anyone else who'd done that would have been SWAT team raided and getting stabbed in the belly by the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang for being a chomo.
Exactly. And I don't know if people in the United Kingdom are aware of this, but there's actually a specific law that is intended to prevent Congress from using their knowledge or foreknowledge of litigation to financially gain from stock trading. But oddly, they've had a really difficult time enforcing this, Shaun.
Yeah, Hillary Clinton made a small investment of a couple of thousand, and within months it was worth hundreds of thousands, and nobody was ever held accountable for that form of bribery.
Yeah. Yeah. So, there's a couple things that are really interesting that haven't come up very much at all in the international conversations of what's going on. And I don't have a clear understanding of what's going on. I don't think anybody has a clear understanding of how this started, how it might end. Have you seen this article from the Canadian Broadcasting Company? This was from July, where a Chinese researcher was escorted out of a level 4 biolab in Winnipeg. This Chinese doctor had traveled to Wuhan and even trained multiple scientists in the Wuhan level 4 biolab. She was escorted out of the Winnipeg facility by the RCMP, and then CBC had a follow-up report in October, just before we started hearing about all this activity with the coronavirus, and they've yet to come forward with any information about what this person was escorted out for, what, if anything, she's accused of, what they know about her involvement with the Wuhan lab. This seems like a very significant piece of information, and not to mention there was that other guy, Lieber, I think his name is, from Harvard, who's also been arrested or indicted or something like that in regard to stuff having to do with Chinese spies.
Yeah, and I think it all definitely needs to be researched and analyzed. But let's go back to the Spanish flu. Spanish flu lasted for over a year. It came in multiple waves. The second wave was the one that did the most damage, 100% fatal for pregnant women, killing people in the 20 to 40 age range because their immune systems were so robust. They responded with all of this mucus, and the mucus drowned them to death. Now, when the Spanish flu hit, what happened was there were numerous conspiracy theories and there were numerous hoax cures. We had the snake oil salespeople out in force, and these viruses might mutate and hit us and kill massive amounts of people. But one thing is constant, that's human nature. Human nature never changes. So I've done some videos on lessons to be learned from the Spanish flu pandemic. If you look at the complete history of pandemics going back 2,000 years, you realize that we've just gone through the greatest period in history in our lifetimes of no wars and no serious pandemics. And going back 2,000 years, that's a complete anomaly. There was the bubonic plague, just hit multiple times throughout the centuries. There was one that lasted 5 years in London. So, nature, these bacteria have been around for billions of years. They look at us as just short timers on the planet, and they periodically come up with methods to outsmart us. They're very sneaky. You've got this one now whereby, we're carrying it around and we're not even showing any symptoms and we're just transmitting it everywhere. And the people who are saying, well, far more people die from flu, that's absolutely absurd because this virus is just getting started. It's only the beginning of the first wave in many countries. The death rate they were quoting was 1 to 2%, and that is 10 times to 20 times more fatal than flu, which is 0.1%, and also 3 times more contagious. Now, they are the kill numbers just from the virus alone. But what happens is when these intensive care units get overrun and the doctors start saying, all right, well, that's a younger person. We're going to treat that person and save that person's life. But all these old people, they're just going to have to die. Then the kill rate jumps up phenomenally. And now we've got percentage figures anywhere from 4 to 10% in some of these countries that are getting really hard hit right now. And I know a lot more people are infected than is being registered, and that's going to reduce that number somewhat. But you also have to compensate for the fact that the lack of the ventilators and the oxygen and all the medical staff who get infected then and have to go home, all the deaths, that's about to cause as well. So my thing has been, I'm getting all this information from the front line in Spain and Italy. I'm not trying to cause panic. I'm transferring those voices to the UK, the US, and all of these other countries so people can be prepared.
So, Shaun, let me ask you this, because this Johns Hopkins University coronavirus tracking website is, one of the sites that people are considering kind of like the gold standard of information. This information here from China shows that it's leveled off and basically no new cases for a long time. How do we account for that?
Absolutely. That's how a pandemic works. So I've got two things to say on this. Imagine you're in a house and a room goes on fire, and you manage to put that fire out, but 3 rooms in the house are now on fire. You manage to put those rooms out, but now the whole street is on fire. So it started in China and it's spreading all over the world. Every single country is going to have a wave like what China had. And we based our original calculations on the Chinese wave. We thought it would peak around the level of daily deaths that China was seeing. But when Italy started to shoot up to 800 deaths a day, we realized we had to revise those calculations. So everybody is going to have that curve, whichever country they're in. And the people who are working in the hospitals in this country are sending me emails, and they're saying that our National Health Service is bracing for the peak to occur in this country in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of April. And looking at the trajectory in America, you guys are jumping up faster than us right now. You had, I think, about 200 died yesterday. We had less than 100. It's going to be even worse there. So that fire that started in that one room in China, the epicenter for that fire now, it's expected is going to move over to the States. And, you've got major categories of people at risk. Look at the levels of diabetes, obesity. You've got the old generation. You've got people who smoke. You've got just people with the long weaknesses and compromised immune systems. Because although America does spend the most money in the world on healthcare each year, it's got the sickest people in the world.
Yeah.
And that's a reflection of the pharmaceutical companies just trying to squeeze as much money out of the people as possible without actually improving their health. And those people now are the low-hanging fruit for this virus.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is interesting. It goes beyond just the pharmaceutical companies because it seems like we're living in a world where everything is an international conglomerate, a globalist. There are all these funds that have holdings in everything from Amazon to Pfizer. Amazon now owns Whole Foods. The United States allows numerous food additives like high fructose corn syrup and hydrogenated oils, artificial sweeteners, chemical products that definitely should not be consumed by people, but yet this is deteriorating everyone's health. A separate matter, but I agree with you. It's preventing everyone from having, sort of a normal, healthy immune system. Now, I appreciate these people who are contacting you and telling you about what's going on in the hospitals and what's anticipated, Dr. Cottrell, etc. There's been a little bit of a disconnect here in New York. I know you're extremely busy broadcasting all the time, and it's difficult to keep up with other YouTubers. I don't know if you've had a chance to see any of the videos that I've been doing walking around New York City, but it's strange to me because the governor days ago said that we were having 1 death per hour, which would be 24 new dead people each day. One of the members of President Trump's coronavirus task force said that 1 infected person could infect as many as 59. I would expect ambulances will be racing around the city picking up coronavirus patients, and this fire department station where they house all the ambulances, I would expect to see guys disinfecting ambulances that just came back from picking up a patient. I've been to this thing 3 times. I've been to 4 of the largest hospitals in New York City. I've seen no sense of urgency whatsoever in any of these EMTs. How does this guy even have a second to talk to me? And the 2 of them said they believe they've seen 3 coronavirus victims, but they can't confirm that because they're not testing in the ambulance. And they're just going on the symptoms of coughing and, like a sore throat, which seems like very generalized symptoms to me. Governor Cuomo has right away rushed to building a triage hospital in the convention center, the Jacob Javits Center. This EMT told me that the reason there are so many ambulances parked here rather than driving around is that they're broken. And I asked him, why don't we just bring in the crew to service the ambulances? You would think if they're taking the precautionary measures of building a makeshift morgue outside of NYU Hospital, incorrectly reported by the New York Post as Bellevue Hospital. If they're building this makeshift morgue and taking all these precautions, why wouldn't they make an effort to fix all these ambulances? And why are so many EMTs telling me that they're only getting about 50% more calls than usual, no activity around the hospitals? I can't reconcile this stuff.
Because you are only just starting to go up the curve. And the people in Italy and Spain who are reading the messages coming in from America and the UK from people who are saying nothing's happening here, you guys are overreacting. They are urging me, they are begging me to tell the people you have no idea what's about to hit you. It comes so fast when it's peaking, and everybody knows somebody that's been infected by it, that's locked down, the military on the streets. You can't leave your house or else unless you've got certain paperwork to show the authorities, or you'll get a fine or you get thrown in prison. And presently in the UK, the lockdown here is still quite loose. But once we start to see those deaths rise to 500 to 1,000 a day, as we come towards the peak of this, that's when all hell will break loose in your country and mine, because the health systems will collapse.
Wow. Well, I mean, I hope there's a possibility that some other outcome could happen. Again, I'm not trying to be contrary, but I'm skeptical because I've heard Paul Cottrell talking about that since February. And there's things that he's said that make me wonder if he is totally correct. He doesn't live stream, and he didn't edit a pretty substantial error that he made. He said that the medical examiner logo was embolized on a truck rather than emblazoned on it. So I don't know why a doctor would mistakenly use that medical term. The other thing that I'm very concerned about, Shaun, is that the panic that is being fomented by the pandemic and the mainstream news. It's creating a real security situation here in New York City. If people saw Sunday with Charles this past Sunday, Charles Ortel and I entered Penn Station. You can see this guy on the right side of the frame walk up behind us. He's eyeballing us, and he stops in the street right behind us and decides it's time for him to enter the train station. So he follows us down the escalator here, and this is normally a very safe place to be. I know a lot of people think New York is just a crime-ridden cesspool, but it's actually the safest large city in New York. Now, what happened here is my camera stabilizer somehow lost power. You can see it's pointing at the ceiling. I reactivate it, and in the course of resetting my frame on Charles and myself, apparently this guy gets photographed, and he starts yelling at me to turn the camera off, but quite clearly he positioned himself right there behind us, I think with the intention of starting some kind of problem. I didn't even notice the guy until this moment where I saw him accelerating behind us, and I made an effort to respect his space and try to frame him out of the shot. Then he comes up and he smacks me. And then he tried to steal the camera.
No!
And normally, Shaun, there is a police, little like desk there where there's 2 or 3 cops hanging out all the time, just maintaining order. There is not a single police officer at their regular stations in here. And luckily, we had a Amtrak police officer walk by that I basically just handed this guy off. I mean, this isn't prison. I don't need to prove myself by squaring off with some dangerous guy who I could get hepatitis just by punching him. So I prefer to, as Sting would say, a gentleman will walk but never run. Confront your enemies and avoid them when you can. So this cop comes over and takes care of the guy. But I'm becoming seriously concerned about a growing safety situation in New York City, not just for people like myself, but the homeless people who have no food. They are probably sick themselves. They could be spreading the virus. No organization is in place to handle this situation, but yet we hear about trillions of dollars going to things like the Javits Center and who knows what, contracts to build these hospitals, when the New York City Medical Examiner's Office told me yesterday, contrary to the reports in the New York Post that have been picked up all over the world, the medical examiner says the city morgue is not at capacity. They are not beyond capacity. Capacity hasn't been met. They're building this makeshift morgue as a standard procedural precaution for a citywide medical emergency. The press is spinning it into something else.
Well, a lot of people are going to pocket money from this crisis. The old adage, never let a good crisis go to waste, comes into effect. And it's really sad. In this country, the spirit of the people showed the government asked for people to volunteer to help the peak when it comes in a couple of weeks' time. And hundreds of thousands of people have volunteered to help, ranging from people taking food and provisions to old people who can't come out of their houses, people transporting people to and from hospitals and such like that. So a huge commendation to the British people. But when it comes to the politicians, to get to the top of politics, you have to be a psychopath. So what do we expect? The taxpayers' money is a feeding trough of trillions of dollars. And if you're in power, you get to hand out all those contracts to your cronies. All those trillions gets handed out and they give it back to you, some of it, backsheesh. It's called political contributions. So coronavirus has come to town and they've thrown all of those corrupt calculations into disequilibrium. So whatever the crisis is, if they can apportion that taxpayers' money to their contractor buddies in other formats, purporting to help the people, that's how these evil bastards will pocket that money.
Yeah, and it's happening already for sure. People who were watching the other day, when I left the Javits Center, where there's still no sign of any activity, I would think if they were building a triage hospital, they'd be busy over there. Frankly, if the car show was happening next week, they'd be busy over there. The thing is dead. There's no activity. I saw one guy sweeping outside of it. Getting back to this police problem, I know you've had various problems with the police in the past. But as I left the Javits Center, very curiously, I noticed at this construction site, this is literally one of the most desolate streets in Manhattan. I don't know if I could find a less traveled street than this. And although I saw one uniformed NYPD officer in 12 days of walking around the city, and here there were 8. This is the Special Tactics Group or Special Response Group, something like that. It's a SWAT team. Look at this. They've got machine guns and body armor. I engaged these guys in conversation to ask them why there were so many police here and so few police elsewhere around the city. I asked them if the NYPD had been stood down. Their answers were bizarre. They didn't answer me directly. I don't understand why they wouldn't just say, "Sir, we're working here, we can't speak with you, call the precinct," or something, and politely send me away. Surprise, surprise, the cops were jerks. But it's weird. I don't get what's going on, Shaun. These guys are telling me they're doing counterterrorism prevention, but they're going to shoot the virus with a gun?
Well, when martial law comes into effect, we lose more of our rights. And as the pandemic intensifies, these guys aren't going to be talking to you one bit. They're going to be slapping you down on the curb and giving you a fine. In terms of security, the prison systems around the world right now are teetering on disaster. They allowed the prisoners in Iran, some of them, to go free in the hope that they could save their own lives. In Italy, the prisoners rioted and people died. And they rioted in Colombia in the last couple of days, and 23 people died because the people who are going to get treated for the virus, the ones who are going to access the ventilators and the oxygen, are the people with the biggest insurance policies in America. And in our country, it's going to be first come, first served on the National Health Service. The people who are going to die are going to be the poorest, the homeless, the prisoners, because imagine if they're turning people away at the hospitals. Last thing they're going to do is send those ventilators to the old people in the prisons. And the prisoners know that. And that's why prisoners right now are kicking off all over the world. They know what's about to happen. And then there's the prison staff. Prisons are hot houses for disease. Intravenous drug use is rife. Where I was housed, hepatitis C, 2/3 of the population had it. TB, there were regular outbreaks of MRSA. So the conditions in prisons are prime for the spread of the coronavirus. And the guys know that right now. And that's why there's this unrest in the prisons around the world.
It's amazing that you can survive prison. It's just so many dangerous things that could happen to you. I mean, what you're describing is absolutely chilling. But so, Shaun, what do you think, as someone who has extensive expertise in prison life and just the details of every aspect of how it works, what do you think about the state of New Jersey releasing 1,000 inmates? I mean, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Well, if you look at the prison population, before I got arrested, I thought prisoners were pedophiles, murderers, rapists, lock them up, throw away the key. And then the media tell you that they've got PlayStations, they've got gourmet food, they've got luxuries, and that keeps the public hating the prison population. Now, when they introduced the private prisons and they mass incarcerated people to fill those private prisons, they got $50,000 a year of taxpayers' money per prisoner. At the height of the war on drugs, they mass incarcerated low-level drug users, with the highest category being weed possession. Over 500,000 arrests a year in America for weed possession. And the Bush crime family and the Clinton crime families were huge on this mass incarceration program. So when I got in prison and I saw the average arrest was a black kid or a Mexican kid with weed, getting like a 2 to 5 year sentence, when half my friends in prison were soldiers who've come back from wars with PTSD, the government has used them up and not give them one shred of help when they come back traumatized. So they've gone on street drugs to self-medicate, and then they've ended up in the prison system. When I learned that prison was the biggest houser of the mentally ill, a third of them couldn't read or write. It was society's most vulnerable people. Then my heart opened and I started to understand what was truly going on in the world. All these predatory corporations making money off the back of it. So I am for a complete reversal of the war on drugs. And everybody who is in prison right now for a low-level drug offense, especially weed, should absolutely be released. And I went to the Hemp Museum in Holland, and according to the figures there, there are still people in America under three strikes laws doing 25 years to life for weed possession. And that makes me absolutely sick. To put someone in prison for 25 years at 50,000 a year costs over $1 million. And all that is just money getting shoveled in that trough, the taxpayers' money getting handed out to government contractors.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. Or at least I certainly agree with your opinion on it. I don't know if people in the United Kingdom or even the United States are aware that former Vice President and, in my mind, 9/11 suspect Dick Cheney was actually indicted in connection with prison profiteering. He was an investor or a board member for Core, what's it called? Core Civic? Corrections
Does
Corporation of America?
Yeah, Corrections Corporation of America are boasting in the annual report to their shareholders that their profit growth is guaranteed because they keep coming back. So they're not correcting people, they're breaking them.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, from that standpoint, I have to agree with you. I'm just curious how these prison releases get worked out and what these people will do once they're released. I mean, we see what's happening in Penn Station and out on the street. Every day that I'm going out, I'm being accosted by extremely aggressive homeless people, which is a huge shift in the behavior for that population in New York. Normally, tons of pedestrians everywhere are able to help the homeless population subsist by, they're panhandling, people are giving them food and money. When the people are off the streets and the homeless people have no source of food, this desperate population becomes increasingly desperate, and I see a really big problem growing.
Yeah, there could potentially be a crime wave. And look at all the people that have been incarcerated over the years unnecessarily for these low-level drug-using offences. I'm not making excuses for what I did. I was a trafficker. I deserve to be punished. These people go into prison. They graduate to heroin, crystal meth injection. They get neo-Nazi tattoos. They're indoctrinated into a world of drugs, violence. To earn your tattoos, you've got to murder people or beat people up. So the prison system has converted normal citizens into people who get out are going to, they're bigger criminals often because they've made their criminal connections in prison and they've been submerged into this world. So, now people get out and we expect them to behave themselves. How the hell is that going to happen?
Yeah.
Prison doesn't work as we know it. Yeah, the pedophiles, murderers, rapists, drug traffickers like me should be in there, but mixing all of these low-level drug users with them has created a crisis now that the coronavirus is going to show, is going to bring to breaking point. There will be crime waves. These people will break out of prison, some of them. Some will be released. How are they going to assimilate after they've been in these hard conditions for years? So it's a dilemma that's been created by mass incarceration.
And recently, Shaun, we had our mutual friend Charlie Robinson on the show here. He joined me with Freeway Ricky Ross, who I know you're very familiar with Ricky's story. He is also an amazing and fascinating guy like you. He's one of the rare people to be reformed through the prison system and realize that he was going in the wrong direction, either going to die in prison or die right away. And he's an inspirational character in the same way that you are. I wonder if there's any way that you and he, or people like you and he, which is a very small group, could get more directly involved. And Trump has been talking quite a lot about prison reform and all that, but I don't know we're really seeing any action on it. I mean, he's got a couple people that he brings to speeches, looks good, but what you're talking about is the real serious problem. Low-level criminals, young kids who make a stupid mistake, spend 5 years in jail and come out murderers and hardened criminals. It's a crime factory, basically. And then we got people like Dick Cheney getting even richer from it.
Yeah, and there's going to be reconciliation. It's imminent. Coronavirus is going to bankrupt many of the states. they're going to have to turn to the feds for aid. And states like Arizona, incarceration central, they spend, education's near the bottom of the list, and the prison systems are near the top in terms of how much money they spend.
Wow.
That is now completely unsustainable. Once the healthcare systems are bankrupted due to coronavirus, they're going to have to start to release prisoners, all the low-level ones, the people who shouldn't have been in there in the first place. And it's about time.
And what do you think about this quote from Ho Chi Minh, Shaun? He's talking about when the prison doors are open, the real dragon will fly out. He's basically saying that this is one of these components of a Marxist type, anarchist revolution. We've heard whispers of this within the United States. Barack Obama's mentor was Bill Ayers. Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dohrn were the leaders of the Weather Underground, a radical socialist movement in the 60s that were terrorists. They bombed the NYPD, they bombed the Pentagon, they bombed all kinds of stuff. On September 11th, 2001, the New York Times ran an article about Bill Ayers, a new book that he had written, and in it, he said that he doesn't regret setting off bombs and that he wishes they had done more. The ironic thing about this article is that, the New York Times gets printed very early in the morning, so for this thing to appear on September 11th, 2001, it had to be written prior to 8:04 a.m., and here he says, I don't regret setting off bombs, feel we didn't do enough. It just seems so coincidental for that to hit the day that, there's a lot of banks in the World Trade Center, there were a lot of cops in the World Trade Center, and airplanes hit the World Trade Center. Bernardine Dohrn had issued a manifesto warning America to guard its banks, guard its airplanes, guard its universities. We hear about these spies being arrested at Harvard. I don't know, what do you think about all this? Could this be a Weather Underground jihadi, Marxist, anarchist plot to destroy America and the world?
The coronavirus, I believe, has come from nature, and people will capitalize on it with whatever motives drives them. When I say it's come from nature, I'm still not 100%. This is a brand new thing. It's not been studied enough. I'm 80% nature, 20% from the bioweapons lab. I'm still exploring both sides. And because it is such a new thing, the people who are talking about it, like you said, Dr. Cottrell and other people have made mistakes in their videos. And I don't think anyone really can know fully what they're talking about until it has been fully studied. We're looking at the patients who have survived it now, who are coming out of China. These are the first case studies being done.
Yeah.
And reports are coming out of Asia now that even people who have survived it, up to 25% of them are seeing some kind of damage to their lungs and to their organs. So never in the history of the world has a virus of this shape savaged itself upon humankind. And all these people who are experts, they're experts in the history of pandemics and they're experts in the history of biochemistry or whatever it is, but we have a completely unknown variable attacking the world, and nobody can be an expert in that because it's such a new phenomenon. So I advise people watching all these videos, and anyone who's saying anything about the coronavirus, to take that into consideration. A lot more is going to come out that we do not yet know because it is so new.
And Shaun, I need to apologize to viewers on the Shaun Attwood channel. It's just come to my attention that there's some technical problem with the live stream. It's not playing on your channel. So we'll tend to that after the show and make sure that your viewers can get it. I don't know why that. YouTube loves the content that you and I produce, so there's no chance that anything could have gone wrong there.
Oh yeah, it's because I did not click on go live.
Oops. Well, we'll take care of it. It's no problem. So let me ask you.
I have no clue how to do live streams.
It's okay. We'll work it out. Let me ask you about this Event 201. So many people have been talking about this. This took place in New York City, October 2019. It was a pandemic simulation that just was remarkably similar to the circumstances that unfolded in Wuhan, China shortly after this occurred. Many people have pointed out that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation hosted this thing. Bill Gates last night in a Reddit AMA suggested that there should be an RFID chip planted in every single person, that they're going to track who's been vaccinated, who hasn't been vaccinated. Bill Gates is basically a well-known eugenicist. Charles Ortel has documented through literally hundreds of hours of evidence coming from the IRS, from official filings, that the Gates Foundation, the Clinton Foundation, all of these groups have conspired to send, vaccines to Africa. They're saying they're going to help children with AIDS in Africa. They've worked with this corrupt Indian pharmaceutical company called Ramboxi, who falsified the results of their drug tests, the efficacy and all that. So we don't really know what these drugs that are sent to Africa are doing, if they're ever received. In fact, Charles has pointed out that it's a much bigger problem in some of these regions of Africa, that they just don't have hospitals or water or electricity. So sending all this money to help people with AIDS when people are dying from like diarrhea and dysentery doesn't exactly make sense. You also are very familiar with the Clintons' prison blood scandal, which arguably was a deliberate attempt to spread a viral pandemic, perhaps not as efficiently as COVID-19. What do you think about any of the interrelationships between some of these sinister globalist criminals?
Okay, a few things on that then. So I believe in the police and the prison system. It should house people who harm other people, drug traffickers like me, killers, pedophiles, rapists. But when greedy, psychopathic leaders get control of the country, they take things to extremes so they can pocket all of this taxpayers' money themselves. Now, the parallel here is I do believe in medicine and I understand vaccine science. But once you get psychopathic leaders and all that taxpayer money they can just hand over to big pharma, you get over vaccination and these massive excesses from the pharmaceutical companies that have caused America to have the sickest people in the world. So yeah, all that is constantly going on. Now, if you can go back like 100 years, people are constantly writing about predicting stock market crashes, and that's going to be done because of such and such a reason. There's a grand conspiracy. Just like people are constantly writing about pandemics, and that could be done because there's such and such a conspiracy. Now, it's a function of time that there will be a stock market crash. It's inevitable. It's a function of time that there will be a pandemic. And then do we turn around and point back at all of those people and say that they were right, they predicted this, and that conspiracy therefore must be correct? Or do we accept that probabilistically this is something that is inevitably going to happen? And I believe that it's all cyclical.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it could be. I don't know the answers to these questions. I'm just very curious because there are some strange coincidences. I mean, I'm with you. I think most sensible people recognize the value in inoculating the population against dangerous and deadly diseases. But as you've been saying throughout the interview, the United States government, the corporate, like the pharmaceutical industrial complex, et cetera, these things have become so intertwined. There really is no delineation between where one ends and one begins. I don't know if you're familiar with Del Bigtree's movie Vaxxed, but that details a story where a scientist from the CDC blew the whistle on some research that had been conducted at the CDC, which indicated that the Merck DPT vaccine was having a hugely statistically significant impact on male black children ages 18 to 36 months. But the director of the CDC suppressed this research and kept the vaccine in circulation. Julie Gerberding later was hired by Merck and got a $5 million job dealing with vaccines. I mean, this is absolutely crooked dealing. So when I see all this information coming from the CDC, coming from the WHO, when you go back and look at the history of these places, they're just rife with corruption. They're the number one thing they're interested in doing is talking about where are we going to send all these trillions? We've got people starving, people attacking people in the streets, and it seems like everything is being not handled correctly.
If people are interested in that subject, I have a true crime podcast on my YouTube channel, 2 hour interview that premieres 6 p.m. London time each week. And I recently interviewed a woman called Sharon Gale. The podcast is called Arrested for Murdering My Own Baby.
Ooh.
Now, she went to hospital one day and the baby was going to have its weight checked. And they said, well, the baby needs to have all these vaccines. And she said, hold on a minute, I'm not sure about that. I'm going to call my husband. She came back and they'd already, after calling her husband, they'd already given the baby all of these vaccines.
Oh.
The baby started to change right away. The vaccine screams, they call it, not eating and not behaving normally. And as the baby progressively got sick, Sharon took the baby back to the hospital and said, look, my baby's getting progressively sick. Can you do something about this? So they would keep the baby for a little bit, and then they would put the baby back in the wellness center and say, the baby's fine now, take the baby home. Now, Sharon was very naive to what was actually going on at the time, but the hospital was actually trying to get the baby to die at Sharon's house so they would not be held liable. There was like a to and fro multiple times. Sharon took the baby back to the hospital. They said it was well again, back to the house, back to the hospital, back to the house. And the baby did eventually die in the hospital. And a doctor said that there was a fracture, a skull fracture. So both parents was arrested. And that allegation of the skull fracture was a complete and utter fabrication. They were both later exonerated. But she could not even use a vaccine defense because she had all these experts from around the world. And they were ready to go up and testify in court. And if they had said what they said in court and that had gone on the public record, it would have caused so much damage to the pharmaceutical industry. They weren't even allowed to use a vaccine defense. So there's a massive wall of money protecting the vaccine industry.
Well, I mean, you've just hit it right there. You've got a credible witness who's saying that medical professionals have lied to protect financial interests. I mean, I'm just wondering, why should we trust the CDC? Why should we trust in the United States? We're hearing a lot from this guy, Dr. Fauci. I mean, you always go to a doctor, you get a second opinion. Doctors disagree about things. Lawyers disagree about things. I'm sure stockbrokers, engineers, whenever you're dealing with something that has sort of an unknown outcome that's based on projections and theories, it wasn't just Boris Johnson who was a proponent of this herd immunity theory. I've spoken to several medical doctors here in the United States that say there is a strong argument that that may be the medically prudent way to handle a viral infection like this. Something like saying, hey, you know what? If you're over 65, if you're having cancer treatment, if you are a transplant recipient, you're in the high-risk group, stay home. But young, healthy people, go about your lives, keep the economy going. What do you think, Shaun? London's got to be stopped in its tracks the way New York is. How many people could die from, becoming homeless? We've heard about suicides, people losing their jobs. How do we weigh the risks of these two very substantial and dangerous to society developments?
Well, we're forced to weigh the risks when it's at our front door, which is what's happened in Italy and Spain, and to allow the herd immunity theory to progress in this country would have caused so much death that the health system would have been in absolute so much disaster. It would have caused chaos throughout the entire country and the economy for a long period of time. Now let's go back to the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
There were cities that were warned that the Spanish flu was coming, and the business owners said, we're not shutting our cities down. And the politicians said, hey, this is so far away from us, it's not going to affect us. And those cities saw the most deaths throughout the entire country. The cities that heeded the warnings and locked everybody down, they minimized their casualties. So going over the cliches again that have been coming in for weeks, it only affects old people. Italy's got an old population. It's not going to come here. The young people aren't going to get it. It's no more harmful than the flu. In this country yesterday, a 21-year-old girl, Chloe Middleton, with no ill health conditions whatsoever died in this country. And when it happens on your doorstep, like it has, then people start to wake up. And we're still only under 100 deaths a day. So when the tsunami hits in 2 weeks, when we're over 500 to 1,000, everybody then is going to be taking the necessary precautions because they're going to be realizing how serious it is.
Mm-hmm. And Shaun, the BBC is reporting that Prince Charles has tested positive for coronavirus. He's certainly of the age that would be a higher risk group, even if it's hitting people of every age. I don't think Charles has any really pre-existing health condition that I'm aware of. What's the response there in the United Kingdom, and what have we heard beyond this report that Charles is positive?
They're refusing to test people and take people to hospital unless you're dying on the floor on the verge of death and you can't breathe. But Charles managed to get a test immediately. So my understanding is from my royal sources is that Charles is trying to give it to the Queen so that he will get the throne before
Wow.
she dies.
Holy cow. That is crazy. Yeah. This is mother.
I'm just being sarcastic.
Oh. British humor.
English sarcasm. Yeah, I take that back. I shouldn't be joking about such a serious thing. I immediately regret that.
Well, but so, what's the prognosis for Charles? Is he being treated? They've spoken about this this pill that the president spoke about, and immediately they said, no, if Trump says it's possibly good, then it's got to be bad. They published a story that some guy died from it, but it turns out that guy actually was drinking some sort of cleaning fluid that contained that ingredient, not intended to be medicine. What about that pill?
Well, like I said early on, it's the people at the bottom of the social pyramid are not going to get the ventilators and the oxygen and the treatment, and they're going to die. People like Charles are going to get the highest quality treatment in the world. But when you're up against a virus like we've got that's unknown to humanity, it doesn't matter how wealthy you are. If you are in the age category of the upper royals, there is still quite a high risk.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think about the BBC's reporting? Is that a news source that you rely on?
The BBC told us that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
I stopped watching TV in the 1990s and, I've started to rely upon reading books and watching alternative media over the years.
Right. And of course, the BBC is still charging you that television tax, right? There's been a lot of talk about possibly eliminating that thing.
Talking about releasing people from prison,
yeah.
Do you know what one of the highest that's put one of the most people out of women in prison in this country, what the offense is? Not having a BBC TV license.
What?
Wow. Not paying for your license.
That's amazing. That's a imprisonable offense.
Yeah, and I think it costs £60,000 to house someone in a prison in this country for 1 year, which is about $70,000+ for not paying a TV license that costs a few £100, a few $100. How absurd is that?
It is very,
again,
very absurd.
That's just more money for the prison system.
Shaun, there was a bit of a dust-up there in England a couple years ago. The BBC broadcast house has this statue created by Eric Gill, who was a pedophile, raped his own daughters, very, very despicable character. The statue basically depicts a naked young boy with an adult man seemingly penetrating him from the rear. There was a huge outcry that people wanted to remove this disgusting pedophilia statue, but yet the BBC broadcast house keeps it there, proudly displayed. What do people of London think about this?
They think that they might as well have a statue of Jimmy Savile right next to it.
Right.
Because Jimmy Savile was the BBC's golden boy for years. And he was Princess Charles' buddy. And when Di and Charles were having marital problems, he was brought in as their marriage guidance counselor. So the BBC's history with harboring one of the biggest pedophiles, and people have suggested that he was accessing corpses for
Hmm.
deviant sexual behavior. The BBC's history with people of that ilk leaves a lot to be desired. And I do have to get ready now I'm interviewing the guy who wrote Spillover, about the viruses, an expert on the pandemic. So I'm going to have to sign off here, Jason, but I
Okay.
really appreciate you having me on.
Likewise, Shaun. Wonderful to be with you here, and I'll make sure that we'll fix that problem later today so that everybody on your channel can get to see the video as well. ShaunAttwood.com is the website. I want to thank everybody for watching and remind people they can sponsor Crowdsource the Truth by going to subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. You can get Shaun's books from Amazon. They're going to be free, one per week, during the course of this pandemic. So while you are locked up in your house, it's a great time to read some books written by Shaun Attwood, educate yourself in the ways of the prison system, and perhaps we'll all learn something more about it. Shaun, thanks so much for joining me. Stay safe there in London, and thanks everybody for watching. I'll see everybody later today.